Right. Thank you for jumping in on this challenge, this 33 days of preparation, which hasn't yet begun. That's Monday, May 18th, when we get going with that. This is just to kind of build up to it. And I wanted to share a little bit of information about St. Louis de Montfort, where we're getting some of the this devotion that we're going to be entering into. And this is the same mode that others have taken too, is let's talk about this saint. And so I'm going to pull a little bit from Father Gately, who wrote 33 Days to Morning Glory, also from John Paul II, in a 50th anniversary letter about St. Louis de Montfort, the 50th anniversary of his canonization. And then the day after the canonization of St. Louis de Montfort, 50 years prior, in 1947, Pius XII also wrote an allocution, and so we can pull from that as well. And then last, the other source for this information is the Catholic Encyclopedia online. You can check it out at New Advent. It's a very short little article. And so with all of these resources, we get an image and a feel for the saint. And if you've ever read any of his writing, you get a feel for it too. It's kind of a mix of old school writing and devotion and practice, and a kind of fighting spirit. But also something I found, at least in my own reading, is that it stirs a kind of fervor. That I don't read his theology and only think theologically. I actually feel a burning urge, a kind of zeal to mimic him, and that is something that's reflected and echoed by popes and others as well. So a couple things about him. One is he started early. 12-year-old St. Louis, he was a devoted young man. You could say that he took part of some of the best youth ministry of his time. He, in fact, joined a society of young men who, during holidays, what they would do is they would minister to the poor and incurables in the hospital, reading to them edifying books during their meals. So they'd go to the hospital. It's kind of an interesting way of going about it. What would it be like to go and read some edification, something good for the soul, while someone is eating their meal, who has a disease that's incurable? Pretty awesome and really in your face outreach and ministry for a 12-year-old and a young man. He was sent to as a day pupil to a Jesuit college, and I say college not as like a university college, this 12-year-old, but he was being formed by Jesuits in his time, which is the late 1600s. He lived from the late 1600s to early 1700s. He, at the age of 19, went on foot to Paris in order to start theology studies. This sounds very similar to St. Ignatius of Loyola as well, 100 years prior. But on the way, he was so fervent that he made a vow of poverty in a strict way. He actually sold off or gave away his clothing to the poor and took theirs. And so he had a zeal even before he started his theology studies. Later, whenever he was a preacher, Pius XII notes that, quote, his one cassock, well worn and patched, was so miserable that beggars meeting him thought themselves obliged to come to his aid by giving him alms. Pretty radical evangelical poverty that was practiced by the saint. Now, we know him for his Marian devotion, not necessarily for seeming like he's St. Ignatius of Loyola or that he's St. Francis of Assisi, but that's the case. He has that much zeal and passion even at an early age, 19. And that lived. He made his vow, but he really lived it. He was also very mortified in the sense that he was an ascetic. He really did take on a very strong asceticism. Pius XII notes that he wasn't much to look at. He didn't have a lot of aesthetic appeal just on the outside, but his constitution was very strong, which was good because he lived a really strict ascetic life. It was also really good worthy of noting, he made some enemies, and they tried to poison him. And so it was good that he had a good physical constitution, because he might not have survived otherwise. Now, he, at 27 years old, was ordained a priest and was for a time a chaplain at a hospital. After his ordination, John Paul II notes that he says, "I feel a tremendous urge to make our Lord and his Holy Mother loved, to go in a humble and simple way to teach catechism to the poor." So he had this sense of call, even though in the immediate he was working as a chaplain in the hospital. At 32 years old, he devoted himself to really what was going to be his mission in life, where he went around as a missionary preacher. During that time, he made some enemies as well, even within the church, that were a little bit edgy about his preaching and how popular he was and his mode of doing it. And so he went on foot to Rome and to talk to the Pope about it. And the Pope sent him back into his field and said, "You're an apostolic missionary." So he was given a kind of freedom within ecclesial circles to preach on behalf of the Pope. The Pope, or at least the Pope, gave him a kind of free pass to go and do as he needed to do. That's pretty cool. So without wasting his time in trying to dazzle his listeners, this is Pius XII in his allocution. He talks about how Louis de Montfort is an orator. His preaching was remarkable. He says, without wasting his time in trying to dazzle his listeners by facile expedients of pretty wit, or by the phantasmagoria of a subtle and studied elegance, he knew how to adapt the treasures of a deep and solid theology to the needs of the most simple people. He excelled in the art of making the most of his learning to enlighten and convince the minds of his listeners, to move their hearts and to shake their wills. I love that, to shake their wills, right? Such was his strength of persuasion that he always ended up by obtaining from them strong and lasting resolutions. Due to his great tact and keen sense of psychology, he knew how to choose and to temper his teaching to suit each particular case. John Paul II saying something similar. He says he invites the apostolic missionary to preach with simplicity, truthfulness, without fear, and with charity, adding, his intention must be wholly and centered on God alone. This is Louis de Montfort. This is a quote from Louis de Montfort. Speaking of preachers, missionary preachers, a missionary preacher, his intention must be wholly and centered on God alone. God's glory must be his sole preoccupation, and he must first practice what he preaches. So you're supposed to have the ethos and the logos if you're ever going to have the pathos in this setting. Now, a couple notes on his temperament. I mean, we know that he was a great preacher, that he lived apostolic poverty and was very zealous and was on foot doing his thing, making some enemies but making lots of converts and stirring people to firm resolutions. He was a guy who had a temper. He was from Brittany, which has Celtic origins. He himself confesses that, and Father Michael Gately does a good job in relaying this in 33 Days of Morning Glory, is that his father was known as one of the most ill-tempered men, or most fiery men in all of Brittany, and he's called by some a volcano frequently erupting. So Louis de Montfort said, I got my dad's temper. Now he tempered his temper and had a lot of self-control and wasn't necessarily always, he funneled it in the zeal in the right direction for the most part, except for one incident when a couple drunkards were heckling him and he knocked them out. So he was a fighter. But he also had perseverance. And Pius XII actually talks about this too. He says that he has the temperament of a Briton, and the outstanding characteristic, though, of Louis Marie, the one which marks him as being essentially Briton, is his unflagging perseverance. in the pursuit of that saintly ideal, the only ideal he ever had, that of winning over men's souls to God. So perseverance is the most marked piece of his temperament. He was, this is one of the most important factors of ever wanting to become a mystic, according to Teresa of Avila as well, is persevering perseverance. And he had it. Quoting again Pius XII in his allocution, forever on the go, ever in contact with people, he was at the same time always recollected. That is, he always had before himself a kind of presence. He's constantly practicing the presence of God. Always recollected, always conscious of the intimate presence of God, battling, so to speak, with divine justice, to obtain from his mercy the grace to overcome the most hardened and obstinate sinners. Like the patriarch wrestling with the angel, he's talking about Jacob, he seemed ever to be repeating that irresistible prayer, I will not let thee go unless thou bless me, from Genesis. I won't let you go, Lord, until you bless me. Right. His secret of success, though, his real secret of success is this devotion to Mary. He has two major pieces of his devotional life, and it's the cross and Jesus and the cross and Jesus' mother. He was there at the cross with his mother over and over and over again. This desire for the cross, at one point he had actually prayed for the grace to overcome the greatest of crosses for Christ, which is a very fervent kind of prayer that only faith makes sense of. And his motto is God alone. So he's theocentric, Christocentric. He is God, it's Christ, that's the end in mind. But it's always through Mother Mary. It's through his Blessed Mother. And so the secret to his success, he would say, would probably be his nearness to Our Lady. His experience leads him to say that, quote, a sinner a sinner had never resisted him once. Resisted him once. He held him by the scruff of the neck with his rosary. And so, in other words, he would pray people in to and be able to preach the rosary and bring them to contrition and firm resolutions. So, last, just to round it off and to lead us into our next little video, is that St. Louis de Montfort, he in his time, he's very much a man of his time in a way and beyond it as a saint, but we need to extricate him from that time and bring him back here because, to quote John Paul II, in our times when Marian devotion is quite alive, it's not always sufficiently enlightened. It would be good to recapture Father de Montfort's fervor and his correct tone in order to give the Virgin her rightful place and to learn how to pray to her. And so, I'm excited. Monday's coming, and so expect some more videos. I think the next one we're going to start talking a little bit about Marian Consecration and the nature of this theologically, and also maybe some hints and tips on how to approach some of the prayers that St. Louis de Montfort gives us in this consecration, because it is in his time, and it might be a little bit tough medicines for us sometimes to be praying these things every day. I know for my part, the Rosary has always been kind of tough for me to pray a Rosary every day. That's a huge sacrifice for me, and I hear St. Louis de Montfort. You read him, and you're like, I got to pray the Rosary more, and I take solace in that, in the fact that Therese of Lisieux as well, she says that praying rosaries has always cost her a lot. It was always difficult for her. So I'd like to let you know some of how to maybe we could look at how to foster the right attitude to Marian devotion with St. Louis de Montfort, and maybe also some of the insights of the mystical tradition of our faith that allows us to grow in prayer. Because by the end of these 33 days, we ought to have grown in our prayer life and our nearness to our Lord and Jesus Christ through the help and the example of his mother. So I will see you tomorrow.